You can't just ignore the board's decision on this merger. It's final.
I assure you, the board serves at my pleasure, not the other way around.
You knew about the risks and you moved forward anyway. People's livelihoods are on the line here.
I understand the risks. The decision stands.
I can't accept these terms. This isn't what we discussed.
The terms are non-negotiable. I suggest you speak with legal.
This situation demands immediate action, not further deliberation.
I understand your urgency, but I will not be rushed into a decision that compromises our position. I am formally challenging your decision regarding the merger. It exposes us to unnecessary risk.
Noted. The decision stands.
My terms are non-negotiable, Mr. Harrison.
Perhaps. But I didn't achieve this position by accepting ultimatums. This decision is unacceptable, and you know it.
My decisions stand, regardless of your approval.
I won't let this happen.
You can't seriously expect us to implement this by next week. It's impossible, and you know it.
I don't expect it. I require it.
The boardroom's sleek glass walls reflected a cold, sterile world, a world where power was wielded like a weapon. Samantha Greene, her blonde hair neatly pinned back, sat at the head of the table, her fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the surface. Across from her sat Marcus Williams, the CEO of Williams Global Enterprises, tall, dark-skinned, and dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of success. But none of that mattered in this room, not in the eyes of the people around the table. The silence thickened as Samantha's eyes locked onto Marcus, her lips curling into a thin smile. "It's impressive that you've gotten this far," she said, the words dripping with insincerity. "I'm sure it must be exhausting, having to work twice as hard to prove yourself." The room held its breath. Marcus straightened, his hands still, but his eyes flared with something more dangerous than anger. The quiet fury of a man who had heard this too many times. "You think your words bother me?" Marcus' voice was low, controlled, each syllable sharp. "That's where you're wrong." He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Before Samantha could respond, Marcus stood up, his presence consuming the space. Every word from his mouth was loaded with power, and every movement, deliberate. The room waited, the tension unbearable. It was only then that Samantha realized she wasn't just looking at the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. She was staring at the man who had the power to burn her world to the ground. The sound of her breath caught in her throat, but no words came. It was too late for apologies. The polished glass walls of the boardroom reflected the cold, sterile world of corporate power. Power that no one in this room had earned quite like Marcus Williams. As the CEO of Williams Global Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar tech giant, he had fought for every inch of success, carving a path where few black men ever had. But here in this room, surrounded by the finest suits and the sharpest minds, his color was still an issue, always an issue. The table gleamed, sleek and immaculate, just like the power that Samantha Greene held within it. Samantha was one of the highest-ranking members of the board, a woman with a platinum blonde bob that matched the sharpness in her eyes. Her icy stare fixed on Marcus, like she was trying to break him. Marcus sat across from her, his fingers brushing against the edge of his tablet. The meeting was supposed to be about the upcoming merger with an international competitor, but Samantha had other plans. Her eyes, cold and calculating, were already making her move. "So," Samantha started, her voice dripping with sweetness, "it's impressive that you've made it this far. I'm sure it must be exhausting, having to work twice as hard to prove yourself. Don't you think?" Her words hung in the air, thick with something insidious. The room stilled. A collective breath was held, but no one spoke. Marcus's pulse raced, but he didn't let it show. He was used to this. He had been called worse. But this was different. This was strategic. This was aimed at breaking him, in front of everyone. He straightened his posture, his jaw clenching. His voice was low but firm. "You think your words bother me?" Marcus asked, looking straight into her eyes. He could feel the weight of her gaze, the unspoken message in her condescension. But he wasn't going to let her win. Samantha's smile didn't falter. "I was just saying it's tough, isn't it? Having to prove you belong." Her words were casual, but they hit with the force of a slap. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. The silence was deafening. Everyone around the table could feel the shift in the room, like the temperature had dropped. He locked eyes with Samantha, his gaze unwavering. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he said, his voice low but sharp. He didn't raise his tone, didn't flinch. He simply stated the truth. Marcus stood up, his movement slow and deliberate. He wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed. The room seemed to lean in, hanging on to his every word. "I don't need to prove anything to you," he continued, his voice now cold and final. "But I'll make one thing clear. You'll regret underestimating me." Samantha's expression faltered for just a fraction of a second. That's all it took. The slightest crack in her carefully constructed armor. But she quickly recovered, her smile returning, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "We'll see about that," she muttered, a final jab, before she turned away to address the others in the room. But Marcus didn't back down. As she spoke, he realized that this wasn't just a single incident. It wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment. This was how it had always been. From day one, he had been made to feel like an outsider in this world of power, money, and influence. Samantha wasn't just a board member. She was a symbol of everything that had held him back. The words she'd spoken might have been light, veiled in politeness, but they were anything but. They were a challenge, an insult wrapped in a bow of condescension. And Marcus was done letting people like her define his place in this world. As the meeting continued, the conversations faded into a blur. Marcus's mind was elsewhere. He was already planning his next move. The power he held was more than just in his position. It was in his knowledge, his integrity, his unshakable belief that the world was changing. And if people like Samantha thought they could crush that change with a smile and a jab, they had another thing coming. But for now, he let the meeting drag on, his thoughts sharp and clear. The next move was his, and he was going to make sure Samantha Greene felt it. The game had only just begun. The elevator doors slid shut, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. The hum of the elevator mixed with the pounding of his heart, the aftermath of the encounter still echoing in his chest. His fingers twitched as he gripped his phone, but he didn't unlock it. There was no escaping the weight of Samantha's words. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. That smug, almost gleeful tone, the way she'd put him in his place, right in front of everyone. As the elevator descended, he exhaled sharply, trying to shake off the tension in his shoulders. But the more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. It wasn't just about proving her wrong. It wasn't about showing her he belonged. He knew he did. It was about power. Samantha thought she had it, but Marcus had more, much more. The doors opened with a soft chime, and he stepped into the quiet lobby of Williams Global Enterprises. The building was a towering symbol of his success, the kind of success that only came with years of sacrifice and proving himself. But right now, all it felt like was a cold fortress, surrounded by walls that refused to acknowledge the kind of world he had fought so hard to be part of. His assistant, Taylor, was at the front desk, a young woman with a sharp mind and an unwavering loyalty. She looked up as he approached, her brow furrowing slightly at his expression. "Everything okay, Mr. Williams?" Taylor asked, the concern in her voice barely masked. "Fine," Marcus replied, forcing a smile. "Just some things to work through." He didn't want to talk about Samantha. Not yet. Not until he knew exactly how to handle it. The betrayal in her words had struck him harder than he expected. Taylor nodded, but didn't press further. She knew better than to ask too many questions when he was in one of these moods. She handed him a folder filled with reports that needed his attention, her eyes still lingering on him for a moment before she turned back to her work. But Marcus could feel her silent concern. She had been with him long enough to know that something wasn't quite right. As he made his way to his office, the door clicked shut behind him, and the silence of the space enveloped him. He stood by the window, staring out at the sprawling city below. The world seemed so far away from this room, from the power that he had fought so hard to claim. And yet, the world outside was nothing like the one that operated within these walls. In the world outside, he could be just another black man, vulnerable, invisible, or worse, a target. Here, he had power. But even that wasn't enough to shield him from the weight of systemic injustice that bled through every conversation, every interaction. Marcus set the folder down on his desk, letting the minutes stretch. The anger still smoldered beneath the surface, but it wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something darker. It was a reminder that no matter how much he accomplished, people like Samantha would always see him as less. It wasn't about his accomplishments. It was about his skin. His fingers ran over the smooth surface of the folder, and for a moment, he considered dropping the matter, pretending it didn't bother him. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. There was too much at stake. He picked up his phone, unlocking it this time. His thumb hovered over the contact for his lawyer, Benjamin Foster, one of the best in the business, but also one of the few people Marcus trusted with the most sensitive parts of his life. They had worked together for years, navigating the delicate legalities that came with being a black CO in an overwhelmingly white-dominated industry. Marcus needed his counsel, now more than ever. But he didn't call yet, not until he was ready to take the fight to Samantha, right where it hurt. Instead, Marcus called his head of HR, Natalie Hayes. She had been a silent ally in the company for years, always finding ways to subtly support diversity initiatives without drawing too much attention. They needed to have a conversation. Quietly, behind closed doors. Marcus. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was steady, calm. She always sounded like she had everything under control, even when she didn't. How are you holding up? Not great, Marcus replied, his voice low. We need to talk about the meeting today. Natalie was silent for a moment. Then, I figured as much. Meet me in my office in 15. Make it 10. The elevator ride to Natalie's office felt like the longest of Marcus's life. It wasn't just the sting of the insult or the slap of injustice still fresh in his chest. It was a realization that this was never going to be easy. Not for him. Not for anyone who had to fight for a seat at the table. And if today was any indication, it was about to get even harder. Natalie's office was a quiet sanctuary amidst the chaos of the corporate world. The room was lined with shelves filled with books, some on leadership, others on law and social justice. It was clear that Natalie was someone who balanced the way of the system with an underlying sense of purpose. When Marcus entered, she was standing by the window, looking out over the city, her arms crossed, as if already anticipating the conversation that was about to unfold. She turned as he entered, her face unreadable. You got a minute? She asked, motioning toward the seat across from her desk. Got all the time in the world, Marcus replied, his voice tight with the anger he kept bottled up since the meeting earlier. Natalie sat down slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. She didn't ask him to speak first. She knew better. Instead, she waited, allowing the silence to hang in the air like a thick fog, both of them feeling the gravity of what had transpired earlier in the day. I'm guessing the meeting didn't go as planned, she said softly, leaning forward. That's an understatement, Marcus replied, running his hand through his hair. Samantha Greene's words were nothing new, but today, it was personal. I'm done letting it slide. Natalie's face tightened in sympathy. You know how this works, Marcus. She's been trying to push your buttons for months. This isn't just about today. It's a game to her. I know. Marcus's voice dropped, but it's not just a game. It's a message, a reminder that, despite everything I've accomplished, people like her think I don't belong in this room. I understand, Natalie said quietly. She was one of the few people who understood the weight of those words. In a company like Williams Global Enterprises, being black wasn't just a matter of identity. It was a constant reminder that no matter how high you climbed, there was always someone waiting to push you back down. What do you want to do about it? Marcus paused. He had thought long and hard about his response, and now that he was here, speaking to someone who would listen, he realized just how far this would go. I want to make her feel the weight of her words. I want to make sure she knows that her kind of power doesn't work anymore. And how do you plan to do that? Natalie asked, raising an eyebrow, already suspecting what he might say next. Marcus leaned forward, the fire in his eyes burning brighter now. I'm going to expose her. I'll use everything we've got, our lawyers, our media connections, our team. She's not just a passive-aggressive board member. She's part of a much bigger problem, one that's been embedded in this company for years. Natalie sat back in her chair, considering his words. You know this won't be easy. It could hurt the company, Marcus. I'm aware. He nodded, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on his chest. But we've been letting this slide for too long. And every time we do, people like her get more comfortable. It's time to take the fight back to them. A pause. Natalie seemed to think about his words, her eyes thoughtful as she glanced down at her desk. You know you're not alone in this, right? There are others who felt the sting of this. Employees who've been passed over, undermined, mistreated. We just need to find a way to unify them, to show them that they don't have to be silent anymore. Marcus nodded, feeling the first wave of relief since the meeting. I'm counting on you, Natalie. We can't afford to let her win. She met his gaze, her expression won a quiet resolve. We won't, but it's not going to be a clean fight. It's going to get dirty, and you'll need to be ready for the backlash. I've been ready for years, Marcus said. The determination in his voice was unwavering. With their plan set in motion, Marcus left Natalie's office, a heavy burden now lifted off his shoulders. But it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. He knew this was only the beginning. The real work was about to start. As Marcus walked back to his office, he glanced around at the sleek, polished walls of the company he had worked so hard to build. Everything around him screamed success. Yet the deeper he looked, the more he realized that success was built on a foundation of silence, complacency, and institutionalized racism. Samantha's words hadn't just been an insult. They had been a reflection of a culture that needed to change, a culture that no longer had room for people like her to thrive unchecked. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He didn't need to look to know it was from Benjamin, his lawyer. They had an urgent matter to discuss. He read the message, the words sending a jolt of adrenaline through his system. Meeting tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. We're going public. Marcus had already decided he would use the media to his advantage, but now it was real. Tomorrow, the first salvo would be fired, and with it, the world would see the truth. The gala was held at one of the city's most prestigious hotels, a glittering affair attended by the elite of business, politics, and entertainment. The ballroom sparkled with the glow of chandeliers, and the sound of clinking glasses and low conversation filled the air. To anyone else, it might have seemed like just another event, another night of corporate networking and power plays. But to Marcus, it felt like a battlefield, one he'd been preparing for quietly in the shadows. Samantha Greene was there, of course, her perfectly styled hair gleaming under the lights, her smile as sharp as ever. As the head of the board, she had taken her place as one of the most influential people in the room, surrounded by men and women who hung on her every word. But Marcus wasn't here to play her game. He wasn't here to smile and nod and pretend. Tonight, he had something to prove. The night began innocently enough, with speeches and casual mingling. Marcus, dressed in a black tuxedo that looked like it had been tailored just for this moment, kept his distance from the crowd, observing the way people move around each other. But then, just as he was about to slip away for a moment of quiet reflection, he saw her, Samantha, and, like always, she was watching him, her eyes cold and calculating. Marcus. Samantha's voice rang out across the room, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. She was smiling, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the same smile she had worn in the boardroom, the one that made his skin crawl. She walked toward him, her heels clicking on the marble floor. I thought you'd be mingling with your usual crowd, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Or are you too busy making sure the merger goes smoothly? The word stung, but Marcus didn't flinch. He stood tall, his expression controlled. Samantha, he replied smoothly, I'm not sure I know what you mean. Of course you do, she said with a laugh, not even bothering to hide her disdain. I just thought it must be exhausting, don't you think? Being the token black CEO, always having to prove you're worthy of the position. I guess it's hard to keep up when you're constantly looking over your shoulder, huh? The words landed like a slap across the face, and for a moment, the room seemed to fall away. People were watching, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, but all with bated breath, waiting to see how Marcus would respond. Samantha's words had been an open challenge, one that many had expected him to ignore. After all, it was just another microaggression, wasn't it? Just another incident of coded language that wasn't supposed to matter. But Marcus wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. Not in front of all these people. He smiled. The smile was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried an edge. "Actually, Samantha," Marcus said, his voice low and deliberate, "the only thing exhausting around here is pretending that people like you have any real power." Her smile faltered for just a split second, barely noticeable, but enough to signal the shift. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp, though she was trying to regain control. "You heard me." Marcus stepped closer to her, leaning in just enough so that only she could hear. "You think you can use your position to manipulate people, belittle them, and make them feel small. But here's the truth. People are starting to see through you." Samantha's face reddened, but she tried to recover with a fake laugh. "I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus. You're reading too much into things." "Am I?" Marcus asked, his eyes never leaving hers. The tension between them was thick now, palpable, and the surrounding crowd was shifting uncomfortably, sensing the danger in the air. "You've been playing this game for years, and I'm done being your pawn. The thing is, Samantha, the truth is always going to come out. You can't hide it forever." Her eyes narrowed, but Marcus wasn't finished. "In fact," he continued, his voice growing colder, "I've already made sure the truth will come out. Soon enough, everyone will know just what kind of person you really are." Samantha opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, Marcus turned and walked away, his steps measured and purposeful. The eyes of the room followed him, the silence deafening as the weight of his words hung in the air. As he moved through the crowd, Marcus felt a small but significant sense of satisfaction. Samantha's mask had slipped, if only for a moment, and he had just made sure the whole room had seen it. But that wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. As he reached the bar, he glanced back over his shoulder. Samantha was still standing there, her face now flushed with embarrassment, her expression tight with rage. It wasn't just the words that stung. It was the realization that Marcus had turned the tables on her, and there was nothing she could do to take back what had just happened. "One drink," he said to the bartender, his voice calm, though his heart was racing. He was a step closer to what he wanted. Exposure. And once the truth was out there, Samantha wouldn't just have a damaged reputation. She'd have to answer for her actions in ways she couldn't possibly ignore. The following week, Marcus woke up to a whirlwind. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications. A video clip of the gala encounter had been leaked. It was everywhere. Social media, news outlets, corporate blogs. The confrontation between Marcus and Samantha Greene had gone viral, with every media outlet taking sides. Some celebrated Marcus's calm and measured response to the microaggression. Others framed it as a public outburst. The coverage was everywhere. By the time Marcus reached his office, the atmosphere felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. People were watching, whispering. There was no escaping it now. The board members had already started calling for an emergency meeting, and word on the street was that they were not pleased with his public confrontation of one of their own. Taylor was already at her desk when Marcus arrived, her fingers flying over her laptop. She barely looked up as he walked in. "There's a meeting scheduled for 11, she said flatly. "The board's calling you in." Marcus nodded, his thoughts already spinning. "Do we have any updates on the media coverage?" "Yes, it's a mess. Some outlets are backing you, but others are spinning the whole thing as an incident, calling it a breach of corporate decorum. Samantha's camp is pushing hard to discredit you, saying you misinterpreted her words and acted out of line." "Let me guess," Marcus said with a wry smile. "They've got their own video editor on the job." "Something like that," Taylor replied, though her lips curled slightly. "But you know the drill. The narrative isn't in your favor right now." "I don't care about the narrative," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "I care about making sure this doesn't get buried. If they think they can bully me into silence, they've got another thing coming." Taylor gave him a knowing look. "Well, you're about to find out how far they're willing to go to protect their own." As the clock ticked closer to the emergency board meeting, Marcus steeled himself. He knew this was coming. A backlash was inevitable. Samantha was a powerful ally, and the people who stood by her would fight tooth and nail to protect her, no matter the cost. The boardroom was tense when Marcus entered, filled with the usual faces. The powerful, the silent players who held the keys to the company's future. Samantha sat near the head of the table, her gaze icy, her posture rigid. She looked every bit the victim, the battered, innocent woman, while Marcus was painted as the instigator. The power dynamics of the room were clear. He was the outsider, the one under fire. But he wasn't afraid of them. The chair creaked beneath him as he took his seat. For a moment, the silence was deafening, and Marcus could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him. There was no hiding from this, no escaping the scrutiny. The board members, those who had stood by Samantha for years, would make their move now. The question was, how far would they go to protect her? Samantha was the first to speak, her voice dripping with false concern. "Marcus," she began, her tone sugary sweet, "I'm sure you've seen the media reaction. It's unfortunate, to say the least. But we need to talk about your conduct. This isn't how we handle disagreements in this company. You've tarnished the company's reputation. You've made it personal. You've embarrassed the board." Marcus's gaze remained steady, his jaw clenched. "I haven't embarrassed anyone. Samantha, the truth is, you've been playing a dangerous game for far too long, and people are starting to see that." Samantha's eyes flickered with something between rage and frustration. She knew he wasn't backing down, but she was still holding on to the reins of power. "This isn't about truth. This is about professionalism," she snapped. "You don't just attack someone's character in public. We have rules, Marcus. We have decorum. And what about the rules you've been breaking behind closed doors?" Marcus shot back, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "What about the microaggressions, the undermining, the way you've made it clear that people like me don't belong in this room? Tell me, Samantha, what you call that? Professionalism?" The room shifted uncomfortably. Marcus could feel the undercurrent of support from a few of the board members who weren't entirely sold on the idea of protecting Samantha at all costs. But most of them were silent, watching carefully to see how the tide would turn. This wasn't just about him. It was about power, and the power players in the room weren't quick to pick a side. Samantha's face reddened with anger, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to one of the other board members, John, a corporate titan known for his strategic mind. He cleared his throat and spoke up, his voice even and controlled. "Marcus, this is becoming a distraction. We need to focus on the company's success. We can't afford to let a personal issue overshadow what's important. Let's focus on resolving this quietly, without further public exposure." "Quietly," Marcus repeated, his voice rising now, cutting through the air. "That's exactly what you've been doing. Silencing people like me. Covering up the truth. Well, I won't be quiet anymore. You've silenced me long enough." John's eyes narrowed. "What's your end game, Marcus? Do you want to fight? Because that's what you'll get. Do you really think you can take this company down with one public spectacle?" Marcus locked eyes with him. "I'm not trying to take this company down. I'm trying to build it into something that's actually worth being proud of. You can't do that by turning a blind eye to the issues right in front of you. The racism, the favoritism, the microaggressions that have been baked into this company for years. How much longer do you think you can keep pretending it's not a problem?" The room fell silent again. The board members exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed. Marcus's words hung in the air like a challenge no one could ignore. Samantha shot Marcus one last glare before speaking again, her voice a controlled hiss. "You're making a mistake, Marcus. You think you can expose me and walk away unscathed? You're wrong." Marcus met her gaze, unflinching. "No, I think you're the one who's about to make a mistake, and you won't be able to hide from it." The tension in the boardroom lingered long after the meeting had ended. Marcus left with a feeling of a battle half won, but he knew the war wasn't over. Samantha had played her cards, but Marcus had no intention of backing down. He wasn't done yet. The next few days were a blur of strategic meetings, media coverage, and legal consultations. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the weight of everything pressed down on him, Marcus found himself questioning his next move. He could feel the pressure mounting, the anticipation of the fallout from his confrontation with Samantha and the board. But there was something else that gnawed at him, a feeling that the betrayal he had sensed in the room wasn't just from her. And then it hit him. It wasn't just Samantha. It was someone else in the room. Someone who had smiled, nodded, and agreed with everything Marcus had said. And now, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the silent support he had once relied on had turned against him. The realization came when he was sitting at his desk late one night, reviewing some financial documents. One of the board members, David Reynolds, had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the meetings. He had always seemed like a potential ally, someone Marcus could trust. But now, looking at the reports, he saw that David had been involved in a series of meetings with Samantha and the other board members. Meetings that Marcus hadn't been privy to. Meetings that, according to the documents, had been aimed at undermining Marcus's position. Marcus sat back in his chair, his hand rubbing his forehead. He had trusted David more than he should have. They had shared countless conversations, both about business and personal matters. David had always been the one who encouraged Marcus to push harder, to take risks, to aim higher. But now, it seemed all that was just a facade. The whispers, the late-night meetings, everything had led to this moment. Marcus needed confirmation. He wasn't going to confront David without being absolutely certain, but he knew one thing for sure. There was no loyalty left in this room. The people he had considered friends were either complicit in Samantha's schemes or too afraid to speak out. He needed to confront David, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed leverage, and that's where Natalie came in. He called her late that night, his voice low with the weight of what he had just discovered. "I think I've been betrayed," he said simply, not bothering with pleasantries. "By whom?" Natalie asked, the concern in her voice evident. "David," Marcus replied, his voice tight. "He's been in secret meetings with Samantha. I don't know what they're planning, but it's not good. I need to know exactly what's going on." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'll find out," Natalie said, her voice steady. "But Marcus, you have to be careful. These are the people who have the power to ruin you, and they know you're not afraid to fight back. They'll come at you from every angle." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice cold now, "but I won't let them destroy what I built. Not this time." The next day, Natalie reported back to Marcus with the news he feared. David had indeed been working with Samantha and the others behind closed doors. They had been discussing a possible coup within the company, a way to push Marcus out while still maintaining control of the company's assets. It wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a calculated move to take down his entire leadership. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Samantha had said. At least with her, Marcus knew where he stood. But David had been someone he trusted, someone who had always seemed to have his back. That afternoon, Marcus called David into his office. "David," Marcus said, his voice deceptively calm as he gestured for him to take a seat. "I know about the meetings with Samantha, the ones you thought were secret." David's face remained stoic, but Marcus could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that filled the room with unspoken tension. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Marcus continued, his voice now tight with frustration, "but you've made a serious mistake." David swallowed, his hands folding in front of him as he sat down, a forced calm settling over him. "I'm doing what I have to do, Marcus," he said, his voice steady but defensive. "This company needs stability, and you've become a liability. You're not seeing the bigger picture here." "The bigger picture?" Marcus repeated, incredulous. "You mean what's best for you?" "Because I'm not buying that you're doing this for the good of the company, David. You've been working behind my back, and I'm done with it." David didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. "You've changed, Marcus. You're too focused on personal vendettas. You don't see that the way you're handling things is putting all of us at risk. Samantha and I are trying to save this company from your reckless behavior." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to maintain control. "Reckless? You call exposing the truth reckless? You're the one who's been lying to me, manipulating the board, all while hiding behind a mask of friendship. I should have seen this coming." David didn't respond, but the tension in the air was palpable. Marcus stood, his eyes never leaving David's. "I've got nothing left to say to you, David. You've made your choice. Just know that I'm not going down without a fight. As David turned to leave, Marcus felt the weight of the betrayal settle into his bones. The walls were closing in. But it wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about taking down the corrupt system that had allowed people like Samantha and David to flourish at the expense of others. The following weeks were a blur of strategy, paperwork, and sleepless nights. Marcus knew the stakes had just reached a whole new level. The betrayal by David had been the final straw. The person he had once trusted was now part of the force trying to tear down everything he had built. But this wasn't just personal anymore. This was war. He stood in his office late one evening, staring out over the city skyline. His mind was racing with thoughts of what came next. The legal counterattack was the only way forward. But Marcus had learned that these battles weren't just fought with words and actions. They were fought with precision, planning, and the kind of pressure that could break even the most well-established empires. Samantha had made her move, and now it was time for him to make his. Benjamin, Marcus said as he picked up the phone, dialing his lawyer's number. I need to move forward. It's time to take legal action. Benjamin Foster, his longtime attorney, answered after a few rings, his voice a steady presence on the other end. Marcus, I've been expecting your call. We've already started gathering evidence, but I want to make sure you're clear on the implications of this. We're not just suing Samantha. This is a full-scale corporate battle. We're going after the board as well. Are you ready for that? Marcus took a deep breath, running a hand over his jaw. I've been ready for years. I'm not backing down, Benjamin. It's time to expose them all. If we don't do this now, they'll just keep manipulating the system. I want every part of it exposed. Understood, Benjamin replied. I'll have my team draft a lawsuit. We'll need to move quickly, but strategically. The media's already watching, so the timing will be key. If we play our cards right, we can hit them where it hurts, their wallets, their reputations. But we need to make sure we have the evidence to back it up. Marcus felt a surge of determination, the thought of going public with everything. The secret meetings, the hidden deals, the manipulation, it sent a ripple of cold fury through him. But he wasn't doing this for revenge. He was doing this to tear down the system that had allowed people like Samantha, David, and the rest of the board to thrive at the expense of everyone else. The next few days were a whirlwind of strategy. Benjamin's team worked tirelessly, pulling together everything they needed to file the lawsuit. Emails, phone records, financial documents, and testimony from employees who had witnessed the systemic corruption. Marcus knew that exposing Samantha for what she truly was, an instigator of the toxic culture, was only part of the battle. He needed to take down the entire system. On the morning they were ready to file the suit, Marcus stood in front of a room full of his closest allies, his legal team, HR, and a handful of employees who had stepped forward to support him. There was an air of solemnity in the room. Everyone knew what was at stake. The lawsuit wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight to redefine what leadership looked like in the company. It was a fight for fairness, for accountability, and for the future of the company that Marcus had spent his entire career building. We're about to make history, Marcus said, his voice steady, his resolve firm. This isn't just about me, and it's not just about Samantha. It's about every person who's ever been silenced in this company. Every person who's been overlooked, dismissed, or treated as less than. This is the moment we take our power back. His words hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the room knew that what they were about to do would change the course of the company's future. There would be no going back. The lawsuit would rock the company to its core. It would send a message loud and clear that racism, favoritism, and systemic abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. Benjamin gave Marcus a nod, signaling that the documents were ready to be filed. With a calm but deliberate movement, Marcus pressed a button on his laptop to officially submit the lawsuit. It was done. The room erupted in quiet cheers, but Marcus knew the hardest part was just beginning. This fight wouldn't be won in a courtroom. It would be fought in the media, in the boardrooms, and in the hearts of everyone who believed in what he was fighting for. Later that day, as the news broke, the media went wild. The lawsuit quickly became headline news, with outlets praising Marcus for his courage. But the backlash came just as fast. Samantha, David, and their allies on the board were quick to denounce the lawsuit, claiming that it was baseless and politically motivated. They tried to paint Marcus as a man who had overstepped, who was playing dirty for personal gain. But they underestimated the strength of Marcus's resolve, and they underestimated the power of the truth. By the end of the week, Marcus found himself standing at the forefront of a movement he hadn't planned on starting. Employees who had once been too afraid to speak out were now rallying behind him. The public support was growing. People were finally seeing the truth of what had been happening behind closed doors. But even as the momentum built, Marcus knew that the fight was far from over. The legal battle was just beginning, and Samantha and her allies would do everything in their power to bury the truth. The stakes were higher than ever, but Marcus was ready. He had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The weeks following the filing of the lawsuit were a blur of media coverage, corporate upheaval, and public scrutiny. Every day, Marcus faced a new wave of pressure. Emails from the board, phone calls from reporters, whispered conversations in the hallways of his own company. The walls that had once felt like a shield were now closing in on him. But he had made his choice, and there was no turning back. He wasn't just fighting for his career anymore. He was fighting for the soul of his company. Samantha's response had been swift and vicious. She went on a media blitz, painting herself as a victim of a personal vendetta and accusing Marcus of using his position to wage a war for power. She had been strategic, appealing to the very people who had silently stood by her side for years, the board members who feared the disruption Marcus was causing. She used her charm, her wit, and her carefully crafted narrative to frame herself as the real victim. But the cracks in her armor were beginning to show. The more she spoke, the more people began to see the inconsistencies in her story. And the more they dug into the company's practices, the more it became clear that Marcus had been right. The toxic culture that he had been fighting for years had been allowed to fester under her watch. One evening, Marcus sat alone in his office, watching the news reports flood in. The anchor's voice filled the room, reporting on the latest developments. Breaking news. Williams Global Enterprises is facing a serious scandal after the company's CEO, Marcus Williams, filed a lawsuit accusing members of the board of systemic racism, abuse of power, and corporate manipulation. The lawsuit, which has already garnered widespread media attention, has shaken the corporate world to its core. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming rhythmically against the desk. He had expected this. The media's attention was inevitable. What he hadn't expected was the growing support he was receiving, both inside the company and from the public. Employees from all levels were speaking out. Whistleblowers were coming forward, sharing their stories of discrimination and mistreatment. The floodgates had opened, and there was no closing them now. But the board wasn't giving up without a fight. The following day, Marcus was called into yet another emergency meeting. This time, it wasn't just the usual suspects. The entire board was in attendance. Every single member who had once been too afraid to speak up, or worse, had silently enabled the abuse, was there. As Marcus walked into the room, he could feel the weight of their stares. Samantha was seated at the head of the table, her expression a mixture of contempt and fear. She was losing control, and she knew it. The others in the room were much quieter than usual, the tension palpable as they exchanged glances. "Marcus," Samantha said, her voice colder than he had ever heard it. "This needs to end. Now, you've made your point, but you've gone too far." Marcus stood his ground, his eyes unwavering. "You're right, Samantha. I've made my point. But the truth is, this company was built on lies, on the kind of favoritism and manipulation you've been perpetuating for years. And now, the truth is coming out. There's no stopping it. You don't understand the damage you're causing," she hissed, her voice trembling with anger. "You think you're a hero, but you're destroying everything. The company will crumble if you continue with this." "Maybe that's the point," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Maybe everything needs to crumble, so we can build something better. Something that doesn't let people like you control the narrative anymore." Samantha's face twisted with fury. "You think you're some kind of martyr, don't you? This isn't just about you. You're ruining the lives of everyone who's worked here for years. You're threatening the very foundation of this company." Marcus's gaze never faltered. "I'm not the one who's ruined lives. You did that long before I ever came along. You and the people who enabled you. And now it's time for that to come to an end." A silence fell over the room as the tension grew thick. Samantha's expression shifted from anger to something darker, fear. The very thing she had spent years manipulating was now turning against her. The walls were closing in. Finally, one of the board members, John, spoke up. His voice was heavy with resignation. Marcus is right. This company has been run by fear for too long. Maybe it's time we face the consequences. The room went silent again. Marcus could feel the shift. The moment of reckoning had arrived. You can't just undo everything we built, Samantha spat, standing up from the table. You're throwing away years of progress for what? To prove a point. No, Marcus said, his voice unwavering. I'm throwing away years of lies. And I'm doing it so we can finally build something real. It was over. The battle had been long and hard, but Samantha's grip on the company had finally slipped. The board members, who had once been her silent allies, were now seeing the truth. The very thing she had feared most was happening. Her world was collapsing. As the meeting adjourned, Marcus walked out of the room with a sense of finality. The storm wasn't over, but had turned in his favor. The exposure had done what no boardroom battle could, shed light on the darkness that had been festering for so long. And now, the fallout was inevitable. The weeks following the board meeting were the calm after the storm, a calm that only served to highlight the seismic changes rippling through Williams Global Enterprises. The company had been shaken to its very core, its foundation cracked by the revelations that Marcus had set in motion. But with the damage came a chance for renewal, a chance to rebuild. And as the dust settled, it was clear that Marcus was no longer just the CEO of a company. He was a symbol of resistance, of justice, and of change. Samantha had been ousted from the company. Her resignation was swift, but it wasn't enough to stop the avalanche of consequences that followed. Her reputation, once polished and revered, had crumbled, exposed to the manipulation, racism, and power games she had played for years. The media had a field day, tearing apart her carefully crafted image. And within a matter of days, her allies on the board began to distance themselves. David, too, had been removed from his position, and his betrayal of Marcus had caught up with him in the most devastating way. It wasn't just the board members who were feeling the fallout. The company's stock took a nosedive as investors pulled their support, wary of the instability and scandal that had rocked the once stable corporation. But despite the immediate financial loss, there was an undeniable sense of change in the air, one that was palpable to everyone who worked at Williams Global. Marcus sat in his office, watching the morning sun break over the city skyline. The weight of everything that had happened still sat heavy on his shoulders, but now it was the weight of accomplishment. He had won, but the victory had come at a cost. The toll had been steep, emotionally, physically, and mentally, but Marcus had always known that true justice didn't come without sacrifice. Taylor, his assistant, knocked on the door and entered without waiting for a response. Her smile was soft, but there was something more in her eyes, pride. She knew Marcus better than anyone, and the battle he had fought was one that had consumed him for months. Everything's moving forward, Marcus, she said, a hint of relief in her voice. The board's backing the changes you proposed. New diversity initiatives, a full restructuring of HR policies. It's happening. There's momentum. He nodded, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes. The company's not just about restructuring its policies, Taylor. It's about changing the culture. It's about ensuring that no one else is ever made to feel like I did when I first walked into that room. Taylor's smile grew, and that's exactly why you're in the position you are now. Because you didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for everyone who couldn't. Marcus looked at her, a slow, appreciative smile tugging at his lips. I didn't do it alone, though. It was the people who came forward, the ones who risked everything to speak out. They're the ones who deserve the credit. Don't sell yourself short, Taylor said gently. You led this. You made them believe that change was possible. Marcus stood up from his desk and walked to the window, his gaze scanning the horizon. The city stretched before him, vast and full of possibility. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his reverie. He glanced down at the screen. It was an email from his attorney, Benjamin. He opened it. The subject line read, "Court ruling in your favor. The settlement offer from the board has been accepted." Marcus exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The legal battle was over. The board had agreed to the terms set forth by Marcus's legal team, an undisclosed financial settlement that would compensate victims of discrimination, fund diversity programs, and establish new ethics boards to prevent future abuse of power. It was a victory, but it was more than just monetary compensation. It was the promise of a new beginning. There were other matters to address, of course. The company still had a long road ahead. The internal work needed to make sure that the toxic culture didn't return was going to be painstaking. But for now, Marcus could take solace in the fact that his fight had not been in vain. The structural changes were already taking root, and the once ironclad grip of those who had used power as a weapon was now broken. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus stood at the front of the company's headquarters, his hands in his pockets. He had returned to this place, the place that had both defined him and almost destroyed him. Behind him, the lights of the building began to glow softly, signaling the end of another day. He could hear the bustle of people filtering out into the streets, going home to their families, their lives. But Marcus knew something had changed. This was no longer a place that thrived on silence. It was a place where truth had the power to make things right. He had taken the first step in an impossible journey, and now he was watching the company move into its next phase, a company that, for the first time, was being built on the values of honesty, accountability, and equity. And while the fight wasn't over, Marcus knew that deep down, he could finally breathe. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the beginning of something truly good. He had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or made to feel small. And that, in the end, was the morning after the settlement was finalized. The headquarters of Williams Global Enterprises felt different. The usual hum of corporate efficiency had been replaced with an air of cautious optimism. Employees walked through the hallways, speaking in hushed tones, exchanging looks that conveyed something more than just business as usual. There was an underlying sense of change in the air. Marcus stood in his office, looking out over the city. It had been a long road to get here, but he could finally see the path ahead. The company was no longer the monolith it had once been, run by the whims of those who cared more about their power than the people they were supposed to serve. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was a start. The legal victory was a turning point, and while Marcus had hoped it would be the end of the battle, he knew deep down that it was just the beginning. The changes were systemic and would take time to truly take root, but that didn't diminish the magnitude of what had been achieved. The fight for fairness and quality wasn't won with one lawsuit, one public confrontation. It was a long-term commitment to changing the very fabric of the company, one policy, one decision at a time. But the changes weren't just happening within the walls of the company. They were happening outside, too. Marcus had used his victory to create a ripple effect in the corporate world. He was invited to speak at conferences on diversity and inclusion, not as a symbol of momentary success, but as a leader in the ongoing fight for systemic change. People looked to him for inspiration, and that weight of responsibility was something he had come to accept with quiet pride. Natalie stood in the doorway, a soft smile on her face as she watched Marcus. She had been his ally from the beginning, the one person he could trust without question. She had seen the toll the battle had taken on him, but she also saw how it had shaped him into someone even more formidable, someone who could lead with the strength of character that was rare in the corporate world. "You look like you're about to conquer the world," Natalie said, her voice light but sincere. Marcus turned to her, his smile tired but genuine. "Feels like it, but the work's just beginning, right?" She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "You know, there's something I've been thinking about," she said, leaning against the edge of his desk. "You won, not just for yourself, but for everyone who didn't have a voice before, for the people who didn't have the power to change things. You've shifted the narrative. You've set a precedent." Marcus's eyes met hers, the weight of her words sinking in. "I don't want this to just be about me. I didn't do it alone. This wasn't about taking someone down. It was about building something new, something better." "It's bigger than you think," Natalie said, her tone turning more serious. "The company's culture is shifting. You've given people hope, real hope, and not just employees. The world is watching. You've changed the game, Marcus, and now you have the platform to do even more with it." Marcus sat back in his chair, the reality of it all settling in. It wasn't just about corporate victory or exposure. It was about setting a standard, showing that those who stood up to the system could actually make a difference. And with that difference came the responsibility to make sure it wasn't just a fleeting moment. I've spent so many years proving I belong in spaces where people like me don't, Marcus said softly, and now I have a chance to do more than just that, to create spaces where we all belong. You already are, Natalie replied with conviction. Look at the people who are stepping forward now. Look at what they're willing to fight for. As the day wore on, Marcus held meetings with department heads and HR leaders. The company's restructuring was no longer just about cleaning up the mess that Samantha had left behind. It was about real reform, about building a workplace culture where diversity was valued, not just because it was politically correct, but because it made the company stronger. Stronger not just financially, but morally. In the weeks that followed, Marcus personally met with employees from every level of the company. He wanted to hear their stories, their challenges, and their hopes for the future. He wanted to make sure the changes weren't just theoretical, but deeply rooted in the lived experiences of those who worked there. His commitment to inclusivity, to fairness, was no longer just a line in a press release. It was woven into the fabric of every policy, every decision that was made. But not everyone was pleased with these changes. There were still whispers in the corridors, still those who clung to the old way of doing things, who felt threatened by Marcus's new vision. Some employees quietly left, unwilling to adapt to the new culture. But for every person who resisted, there were dozens more who stood by Marcus, ready to help him shape the company into a place where everyone had an equal chance. In a final act of poetic justice, the company's quarterly earnings report came in. Despite the initial drop after the scandal, the changes Marcus had instituted had strengthened the company in ways that were already becoming clear. Customers, both new and old, began to see the company's commitment to fairness, to equity, and to real change. The financials started to stabilize, and growth projections began to look more promising than ever. But even as the company's fortunes improved, Marcus knew that the real work wasn't in the balance sheets or the stock prices. It was in the hearts and minds of the people who worked for him. His mission wasn't just to be a CEO. It was to be a leader who could inspire change, not just in the business world, but in the broader societal landscape. As Marcus looked out the city one last time before the close of the day, he realized that his journey had just begun. The fight for justice, for fairness, was never over. And now, he was ready to lead the charge, not just for his company, but for every person who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or oppressed. The legacy of his fight wasn't just in the changes he had made. It was in the doors he had opened for others to follow. And in that, Marcus found peace. For the first time, he could see a future where change wasn't just possible. It was inevitable.